Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar organized by the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. I'm Salome Letman, and I work for Mercy Corps as part of the Alliance. I just want to say a few words before handing over to our brilliant panel today. We're meeting at a key moment for adaptation, with Brazil as the COP30 presidency really making adaptation one of its key priorities, with the GGA global goal on adaptation to be agreed in Belém. Yet adaptation remains severely underfunded, and many are looking to the private sector to fill that gap. At the same time, it's nice to see that the importance of public adaptation finance has taken on new weight with the recent ICJ advisory opinion. This quite landmark ruling reaffirmed developed countries' obligations to assist vulnerable countries in meeting the costs of adaptation and reinforced the need to really scale up their adaptation finance contribution. But many developed countries that have been leaders on adaptation finance are near the end of their multi-year climate finance commitments. And this actually together with the end of the doubling target from COP26, which sunsets this year, means that there's actually very little predictability for the future of adaptation finance. And that lack of predictability and clarity is quite concerning, because without forward commitments, countries that are struggling with the effects of climate change can't plan, implement at scale, or build the resilience that communities urgently need. So securing new adaptation finance pledges ahead of COP and agreeing a new ambitious adaptation finance commitment to replace the doubling could lead to much needed political momentum, but also help unlock adaptation negotiations in Belém. With many looking to the private sector to fill the adaptation finance gap, we as the Alliance felt that what was actually missing to date was an analysis as well as evidence as to whether and in what way that's actually feasible. So we decided to commission research to explore the role, potential, and opportunities for private adaptation finance in developing countries. And we'll hear more about this from one of the authors of the report that was just published yesterday in a moment. And I'll finish by saying that our discussion today is quite timely and important in the sense that, Africa Climate Week is underway, the upcoming Africa Climate Summit, New York Climate Week, and all these milestones ahead are all real opportunities to elevate adaptation finance on the international agenda and make progress at COP. So I'm really happy to be joined today by a great panel. We'll first hear from Marcia Toledo, who's the Director for Adaptation and Resilience from the Climate Champions team. Then from Paul Watkiss, who's the director of Paul Watkiss Associates. He leads the author theme of the finance chapter of the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report and co-authored the Alliance research, which he'll present today. Then we'll hear from Berta Argueta, who's the senior advocacy and policy officer for Eurodad, followed by Rigden Hoods, the Dutch adaptation negotiator. So I really look forward to hearing from all of you how we can collectively raise ambition and strengthen adaptation finance in the months ahead. We'll then have about 25 minutes for Q&A, so please don't hesitate to, at that point, raise your hand, ask questions to the speakers, and I'll really ask our panelists to stick to the time, so we'll have time to exchange afterwards. I'll send a thumb up when your time is up. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Marcia, who will share her insights on the COP30 Finance for Adaptation objective, which is leading as part of the Joint Action Agenda. Over to you, Marcia.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today with all of you and to offer this discussion on adaptation finance as we gather and join forces on the road to Belém. Let me start by sharing two key elements of context first. First, the role of the climate change high-level champions. So their mandate is to bridge the formal negotiations with the real economy actors, mobilizing businesses, investors, cities, regions, civil society to accelerate the delivery of the Paris Agreement. My role as Director of Adaptation and Resilience for the Climate Champions team, I support the champions and in that mission, in convening coalitions, strengthening partnerships, aligning efforts behind common agendas and mobilization campaigns. But we have to recognize that adaptation is not just something that exists today, because we are having a massive prioritization on adaptation in this COP, but it's actually a process that has several decades on the making and connects real actors on the ground. And so previous efforts existed and continue, and we want to elevate and identify how to reach them and bring them to scale. And on that view is that the COP30 action agenda is bringing a unified vision with the presidency and the climate champions on a framework that responds to the global stock take. For the first time, we're not looking at themes that are randomly aligned, but is actually very much to respond to the global stock take. That already on its own helps bring the clarity for accelerating the pace and the scale needed in regards of adaptation. And we have a COP30 action agenda that is aligned regarding those 6 thematic areas and 30 key objectives, as they believe this could be critical to accelerate at the moment that it requires. And under that, the action seeks to focus on enabling, so accelerating climate finance, technology, and capacity is where it brings adaptation finance to its core. To move adaptation finance from the margins, but to the center of global climate action, and directly addressing how to close the global resilience deficit. We all understand in practice we're facing climate risk exposure without sufficient financial buffers, especially vulnerable people, vulnerable nations, underinvestment in essential systems in regards of healthcare, water, energy, human settlements, food, and others. We have fragile supply chains, not prepare small and medium enterprises and other actors of the community and front lines under stress, low insurance penetration in high-risk regions, and also the fragility of the actual economy actors like private sector with their supply chain, but also across their value chain. So finance for adaptation is a priority, and it's being brought exactly with that lens to be a pillar on opportunity to develop and grow and advance, and not to be an afterthought. And our goal is to move beyond what we already recognize exists. There exists lots of action tools, mechanisms, also commitments, but really bring the focus on deliverable, measurable outcomes. What are the resilience gains? What are the specific solutions that have been accelerated and implemented? What is the capital mobilized? What are the pipelines of investable solutions that close that resilience deficit? How we are connecting developing banks, private sector, philanthropy, cities and regions of national finance with the national adaptation plans, with potential also country adaptation platforms, etc. This effort is fully aligned with the UNFCCC negotiation track. While the new collective quantified goal on climate finance is still in development in regards of what can be feasible for accelerating public finance for adaptation, the action agenda provides the complementary political momentum and practical delivery, connecting the dots between the negotiation and the implementation, and linking those commitments so that it can be an opportunity to accelerate action. At the level of the action on the group of 21, which is focused on finance for adaptation, the legacy of the COP is framed around those tactical plans that it's like connecting what we've had before, a 2-dimension, for example, already tools, solution approaches, but bring them into a different scale, aggregate them, and identify how these are addressing system change, levers in regards of policy, levers in regards of finance, accessibility, and levers in regards of more inclusivity and other lenses that have been in the past not necessarily well aggregated. That's where the opportunity lies, in the engagement, in the mobilization across those initiatives. And so what we are hearing and what we are understanding the ecosystem is actually eager to contribute on the road to COP is around strengthening national adaptation plans, defining minimum information requirements, capacity, and structured pipelines of projects so they can become true investment vehicles, as well expanding innovative finance mechanisms, scaling debt swaps, resilient bonds, parametric insurance, resilience contingent finance, are already proved tools, mechanisms, but this is the opportunity to reach to scale and mainstream them. Similarly to bridging public-private gaps, developing shared taxonomies, metrics, and convening structured dialogues between private sector, central banks, with finance ministries. We are really seeking to connect and bring more of the articulation in this process. Similar in regards of accelerating South-South and cross-sector collaboration. We cannot just believe this is about mobilization of finance. It's really critical as well to understand and bring evident accessibility of finance and how this is relevant at the local level. This is why the presidency, together with the climate champions, is making finance for adaptation a political and urgent priority, creating the spaces through this activation process to connect the real actors, but also to articulate what are those strategic, tactical next steps so that we are not just seeing instruments and processes separated, but maximizing the aggregation, really addressing system change. And make sure that we can elevate adaptation at every forum, from negotiation to fiscal planning to country platform to capital markets. So my message today is very simple. We understand the gap is real, is massive, but the pathway forward is within our reach. If we align that political will with credible evidence and a reshaped financial architecture, COP30 in Belém can mark the turning point. And we want to make sure it's remembered for that. Really practical approaches to bring the gaps that we have into an opportunity that can be closed and real clear action from all the real economy, but also government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and very much aligned with your message. It's great to hear that adaptation finance is being prioritized, and actually with this topic being championed by the presidency and elevated within the action agenda, I think it's really important to understand how to fill the adaptation finance gap. And I guess in the current context of reduced aid budgets, rising debt levels, tightening fiscal space, many are actually looking to the private sector as a solution. Even in the NCQG decision itself, calls on all actors, mentioned both public, private sources, and this really requires a careful exploration of the role, the limitations for different kind of public and private finance. So on this note, I'll hand over to Paul, who will tell us more about the latest Alliance report, which he so brilliantly wrote together with Kit England. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you. So just to check, can you hear me and can you see that the slides moved over to the next one? Excellent. Well, thank you ever so much. It's a great opportunity to talk to you today. I'm going to whiz through this, and as Salome has said, I want to thank Kit England, but also a large number of other contributors that I don't have time to go through. So what's the background? Well, we're looking at, and this work builds on the adaptation gap report and the adaptation finance gap, and that context that was mentioned about the responsibility of developed countries to support and assist adaptation in developing countries. And so what we've been doing for a number of years is trying to look at what that adaptation finance gap is, the difference between what developing countries need and those international public adaptation finance flows. And our latest numbers, and these will be sort of formally released later in the year, are that developing countries probably need around $320 to $400 billion a year in the context of 2035 and the NCQG. And if we compare that to current international public adaptation finance flows, they're only about $30 billion a year. So you have an enormous gap, and I think everyone's aware of that. And in that context, we're trying to bring a little bit of evidence here to say what really could the private sector do, and also to ask some questions. And this is very indicative, of course, but to try and get some insights to help us. So the first thing I have to do is I have to say we have to be very careful about what exactly it is we're talking about. And we're talking about the public and the private sectors. They have roles that are quite well defined and some where they work together. And so on the left of my diagram here, there are some things that historically the public sector has delivered. So for example, major flood protection. And there's some areas on the right-hand side in blue that are kind of the public sector doesn't go near. Private sector, putting air conditioning into factories, it's entirely private funded. And in the middle, there's a mix where public and private actors come together for various reasons. And what I want to really stress is that what we're focused on here is the sorts of actions that countries are asking for assistance on in NDCs and NAPs. Someone says they're not seeing my slides. Can I check?
I'm seeing your slides.
Okay,
I'm seeing,
well,
yeah.
okay, well, that's good enough. Okay, so on the right-hand side, there is a very large amount of finance that is needed for the private sector to deliver its own adaptation. That's an enormous potential for the private sector, but we shouldn't mix that up with the more public priorities that are in NAPs and NDCs. No NDC is asking for money to put air conditioning in factories, you know. So what we're looking at is whether the private sector can help us get that 320 to 400 billion target. And to do that, we also ask one extra issue, and that's a little bit complicated. It's about the difference between financing and funding. And the easiest way for me to do that, I think, is to give you a quick example. I'm from the UK, and in the UK, we spend around $2 billion a year on flood protection. Now, that's nearly all, even for us, nearly all is paid for by the public sector. But we do, of course, go to the private financial markets with green bonds to get some money for that. We do employ and procure services from the private sector. But it's that bit in the middle that we're really interested in here. Who pays for adaptation? And that's really important in the context of developing countries, because we can raise the finance, but if all of the money actually comes from the developing countries themselves, particularly from the most vulnerable, we haven't really solved the funding gap. So what we've been doing is, to start with, just to take a very quick snapshot, we asked the question, well, what's the private sector doing already? And there's two really good evidence lines that we have here. One is OECD tracks the mobilized private flows to developed countries, I should say to developing countries from developed countries, and that counts in the negotiation targets, and that's around $3 to $4 billion a year. And CPI has done some really amazing work extending that to look at private sector flows and have a value of around $5 billion a year. And I know they highlight that that's definitely an underestimate. But taking those two at face value, you add them up, and what we sort of have here is that the private sector is delivering around 3% of adaptation finance needs. That's of that larger number. And there's a reason why that's so low, and that's because there's barriers to adaptation. I think someone's got their microphone off, perhaps on. Can someone just, we can hear some feedback. And there's lots of barriers to adaptation, but the most important one is that it tends not to generate revenues. So it's much more difficult to get a financial return. So what we've been doing is we've been taking our estimates, that $320 billion a year, and we asked the question, and this is a very simplified example, based on the sorts of interventions that we think we need across different sectors and across different countries, and we are working here at the levels of individual sectors and individual countries and aggregating up, where are the opportunities where the private sector might have a strong role? Where are the areas where the public sector tends to dominate? And where are those mixed sectors where we could perhaps bring a greater set of private sector actors to the table? Now, because of the time, I'm going to go straight to the results. And to be honest, this isn't really a surprise, but actually when we look at the sorts of things that are in NDCs and NAPs, they tend to be very public in nature. They tend, and we think, that when we add them up, they're about 3/4 of the needs that we have on the table. So in terms of that 320 billion, we think about 75% just because of their nature, whether they're major public flood investment, whether they're social protection, whether they're health services for the poorest. There's lots of things in the adaptation space that tend to be delivered by the public sector. More positively, that means that there's 25% where there's a real opportunity for the private sector. In practice, at the moment, that's going to be lower, but we still think you could reach 15%, which is about $50 billion a year, just by trying to get a greater private sector share. Now, that will be lower in LDCs and LICs, just because it's more difficult for the private sector to invest in those countries. But I really want to stress, going from 3 to 15% is not nothing. It's a 5-fold increase. That's a really strong increase. But we also have to be honest that it's very unlikely the private sector can fill the gap. The private sector isn't going to go from 3% to 75%. And I think another thing that I would highlight is actually delivering that 15% isn't going to happen if just left to the markets. We are going to need to incentivize it. And as I come on to a little bit later on, we are going to need some public money to de-risk the private sector. So I think it's worth asking, is there other evidence that backs this up? And I want to highlight two things which I think really reinforce the messages that we're starting to find. The first one is blended finance. Now, blended finance is a really kind of hot potato at the moment. Everyone's really interested in it for adaptation. And what we've been doing is been looking at the role of blended finance, which is where we take some public finance and use it to unlock private sector investment. And Convergence have very generously, who have a blended finance database, have very generously allowed us to look at some of the data and some of the tags for adaptation in their database. Now, the results in the top right, and it's a very simple message. There is lots of blended finance starting to appear, particularly in the agriculture sector for adaptation. So that's good news, but also it reinforces that message that there's certain parts of the landscape where the private sector can act, but across the whole span, it seems to be much more limited. And the other thing that I think is very important from that database is when we look at how much public money we have to put in to get the private sector to invest, the mobilization and the leveraging ratios are much lower for adaptation than they are for, say, mitigation or other development activities. So we have to put a lot more public money in to get the private sector to unlock those markets. And at the bottom, we have another evidence base. We're looking at adaptation accelerators and facilities, and these are really great initiatives that are starting to support private sector companies with new ideas, new business models, and looking to see how those could be scaled up. And again, we've been looking at lots of the evidence, collating that together. And again, you can sort of see a very strong picture. What we find is a real emergence of innovation in some of the key market sectors, particularly agriculture, particularly where there's carbon credits. But again, a very flat picture across other areas. And that really sort of reinforces that message that the private sector does have a role, but it's going to be the more obvious private sector, market sectors where that's going to happen. And it's going to be much more difficult to kind of reach the bridging under the gap in other areas. And just as a final thing, we have gone a little bit further, and this is sort of quite initial, but we've asked the question, what if you really tried to do more? What if you really said our focus is on other areas? Is it possible? And what we do there is we've started looking at some of the emerging literature and some of the emerging case studies on innovative models, approaches, financing, approaches, the whole lot. And I want to give you a very quick example on the top right with coastal and river flooding, where you can see, if you look, 7, 8, even more different innovative financing models that are being listed, and case study examples that give you an example of those. And that tells us something which is really rather interesting, because on the one hand, you look at this and say, well, maybe there's some greater opportunity to bring the private sector in. But what we find is most of those additional models, because they're in sectors that are typically, public goods or have very quasi-public good characteristics, the models that work to actually get the private sector in actually involve cost recovery models that pass the costs back to developing countries themselves. What it means is actually they're predicated on the government paying for these, or local people through either taxes or through, say, water charges. You're still passing those costs back to the developing countries. So you can sort of solve the financing gap, but you haven't addressed the gap about how do you assist developing countries in actually paying for the adaptation themselves. Very quickly, there are a couple of areas, and I've highlighted areas quickly. There are some areas that have much more potential. There's not so many of them. They can be around co-benefits. They can be around some innovative things such as land value capture. These seem to be able to actually generate new revenue streams that can help pay for adaptation. And we definitely think there's much more potential there, but we don't think they're going to fill the gap. A lot of them are quite complex to do. They definitely have potential in some specific markets and localities, and we should really focus on them. But again, we have to be a little bit cautious about being too optimistic. So I'm going to conclude. There is potential for the private sector. It's probably more modest than we hope for or that many think. We start from a low base, and that's really important to highlight. We can get up to perhaps 15% through the sort of standard businesses models, and that's not nothing. Going from 3 to 15% will involve a lot of innovation, and it will involve public support, but it's possible. I think if we start to push above that, we start to get into areas where we may be able to get some innovation, but a lot of that will actually not solve our funding challenges. And I just want to highlight with, a sort of, partly good news stories. There are a few areas where there's a greater opportunity, but the sort of inevitable consequence of this is we look at this and we say, well, we are going to need more international public finance. We're going to need it for the areas that only the public sector can deliver in countries that can't pay for it themselves. And we are going to need public finance to actually scale up the private sector. And so we have to be slightly realistic about here, positive side, but also some more modest ambition and realism. And on that, I'll say thank you very much. Pass back. Thank you.
So much, Paul, for the clear and quite concise overview of such a detailed report. And actually, if I could ask some of my colleagues to drop the link to the report in the chat so you can all access it, it'd be fantastic. And I really hope that the findings of the report will inform discussions on the realistic role of the private sector in reaching the 1.3 trillion as agreed in at the last COP. I think it's also important to ask that, if the private sector potential to bridge the adaptation gap is lower than we assume, then what else can be done despite the geopolitical context, particularly for SIDS and LDCs, where the private sector potential remains the lowest. So on that note, I'll now hand over to Bertha, who will go into why public finance for adaptation remains quite critical and discuss what the potential routes to increasing international public climate finance are.
Yes, thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me. And it's actually great to come right after that presentation, because I think it clarifies a lot of things that as civil society especially we have been addressing for the longest time. So I think just to start and summarize the points that I think are important in all of this is that private sector finance for adaptation is an option, but it's an option that has very clear limits. Not only in terms of the sectors that can be tackled, but also in the fact that it will mostly flow to middle income countries, leaving behind a lot of the lower income and more vulnerable countries, which will still depend largely on public finance. At the same time, I think the distinction between funding and financing is extremely important, and one that we should really, really highlight more and more, as it shows that private sector finance, though not only private sector finance, but some types of public finance that are mostly non-concessional, as solutions are actually likely to put the burden of paying for adaptation on the shoulders of those most in need and most vulnerable. And this means putting the pressure on fiscally constrained countries and very vulnerable communities to pay for their own adaptation. This is why public finance continues to be extremely important for adaptation, particularly for those sectors, regions, and populations that are not served and are not likely to be served by private finance in the future, simply because it's not attractive to them. And we can keep pushing for this as much as we want, but the evidence has been there for a long time, and this is adding to that body of evidence that is simply not going to work because the private sector has a very specific logic. I think it's important as well. This is something worth exploring a little bit more. That private investments are not necessarily, what I mean is the outcomes of these private investments are not always or not very clearly followed. So we don't know, we can see that private finance is flowing toward adaptation, but we don't know if that's actually building adaptation and resilience. And I think the impacts of these finance are something that also is worth exploring further, as private sector is obviously more interested in financial returns than in actually, serving the communities. And so it's important to keep that in mind, that we're not certain that actually this is building adaptation and resilience. So this highlights again the importance of public provision of climate finance, particularly in the form of grants that doesn't put the burden on the vulnerable countries and communities. And this should be at the core of the climate finance discourse and practice, even though we acknowledge that private sector can play a role, but that is not the core of this discussion. And in doing so, the NCQG last year, for example, the new collective quantified goal really failed to frame this as an important, and frame adaptation as an important and critical need for developing countries, because it lacks a concrete target for adaptation. So this is something that we believe, for example, that this year COP30 could address. It's an opportunity to correct what the NCQG couldn't achieve by establishing or exploring the potential to establishing an adaptation finance target or some sort of agreement. And this could be both collectively, for which, for example, there are already proposals by the LDCs, the least developed countries, on tripling of adaptation finance by 2030, and this is obviously public finance. we've seen also that they have really like highlighted this, but we also have now proposals. For example, our colleagues from NRDC recently published different scenarios that how this target could be framed as a specific target, a multiplication target, a growth rate target, or a share of the total climate finance, so that we can give concrete direction and predictability to the availability of public finance. At the same time, and I think, Salome, you mentioned this at the beginning, it is also an opportunity for some contributor countries to establish individual targets, let's say their own multi-year adaptation finance pledges, to ensure predictability and build towards the achievement of the goals of the NCTG. I think an important discussion will also be on the most appropriate way of establishing these commitments, whether it is the Baku to Belém Roadmap, which is not a negotiated outcome, but it could send a very strong political signal, or if there are negotiated tracks where this can be done. And then maybe just to finalize, I think the quality of the finance will be important. This discussion on quality will be very important. We have seen, for example, it was highlighted in the report that there is public finance can be used either as direct adaptation support, supporting direct action, or for mobilizing private sector investments. So there is a trade-off in there. And I think we need to be very careful, especially due to low mobilization ratios, not to allow de-risking and blended finance to cannibalize large parts of public finance that could be better used to support direct adaptation action. And finally, kind of referring to the first presentation, the first comments, if we're talking about systemic change, and I think that was something that was mentioned, I think this is really important, and this could really be something that could be elevated more at COP30. And looking at the changes that can tackle issues like limited fiscal space in developing countries and policy space that could allow them to fund some of their own adaptation, because let's be real, this is going to happen, it's already happening, it will continue to happen. But if we can give them more fiscal space, more policy space to make those choices through, for example, addressing debt sustainability issues, this could be very important, or the cost of capital, this could be very important, but also addressing systemic changes needed in developed countries, in those that will provide, but not necessarily only developed countries, in order to raise additional funds for adaptation. So in terms of taxation or new taxes and so on, things that can really raise more finance in this moment of very limited and decreasing ODA, that can be directed, partly at least, to adaptation and provision in developing countries. I think those things, the more systemic things, are also critical in order to really elevate adaptation and increase adaptation finance. And I think that's all my time, but thank you very much, and looking forward to the questions.
So much, Bertha, and thank you again for underlying the importance of public adaptation finance, and also showing that there are ways to increase the public finance available through polluter-based levies and taxes, also through in the shorter term, repurposing harmful fossil fuel subsidies. I think a key element of that is also building momentum through, for example, the work done by the Global Solidarity's Levies Task Force, which I think is publishing its reports quite soon. So on that note, I'll now give the floor to our last speaker, Rick, who leads the work on NAPS on behalf of Netherlands. And the Netherlands has been championing adaptation for a long time. So I'm really hoping to see the Netherlands lead on adaptation finance at this COP. And I'll hand over to you, Rick.
Thank you so much, Salome, and I hope you can all hear me. I seem to have lost connection.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay,
we can
perfect.
See you and hear you.
I don't see the slides, but I reckon they're up. Anyways, it's great to be part of this session, and it's also very interesting listening to the speakers before me, and also hearing Paul present, I think, a very valuable report. So indeed, my name is Rick den Hoed. I work for the Dutch government, and I lead the EU negotiation teams on NAPS and LDC matters, so quite involved within the adaptation negotiations. And that's also the angle that I'll take, which might be a little bit different from the speakers before me, who came more from a purely finance based perspective, which is very interesting, at least for me to hear. Anyway, so I wanted to start off very quickly with where we are currently at the UNFCCC, and it's important to look back a little bit for a second and think that adaptation was not always in the spotlight. Unfortunately, when we started, adaptation was very much kind of on the margins, and this has changed only very recently with the global goal on adaptation being included in the Paris Agreement as a first real breakthrough. But we were still, stuck with the goal, which was potentially too general, too vague, and it also lead to a conclusion in the first global stocktake that adaptation efforts remain fragmented, incremental, sector-specific, and evenly distributed, which I think is a clear message and maybe a code word for we need to do more and we need to do better. Since then, we established a new and strengthened adaptation architecture, which includes a UAE framework, which obviously sets 11 targets for how we do our adaptation. We set a deadline for all countries to have national adaptation plans by the end of this year. We included new guidelines for national adaptation plans to make them more suitable for attracting finance, both from public and private sources. And we're working, as you're all probably aware, on adaptation indicators, which are supposed to guide our collective efforts. Now, I don't see the slides, but I then had a slide included, which kind of includes this kind of architecture as I see it. So we have a global goal on adaptation, which kind of broadly frames where we are in the what we want to do. It's an aspirational goal with the UAE framework operationalizing that, and then we have the national adaptation plans, importantly translating these global kind of policy commitments to local level action and implementation. That's actually what our area of focus obviously should be, because that's where the change happens. Now, this is supported by various ways of finance and through the NCQG and other avenues, and then measured hopefully after this COP by a solid indicator process. Now, support for adaptation comes in many shapes and forms. I think we can all agree here in this call that support for developing countries is essential. It's essential to protect livelihoods and save lives, and it's essential for allowing and giving developing countries also the space to kind of further build up their more resilient societies towards the future. There's a strong need for public resources to do this. We can happily acknowledge that, particularly when it comes to, and we also saw that in the presentation by Paul, supporting those countries that are most vulnerable. So particularly the LDCs and SIDS need a larger share of public finance. Now we're dealing with an urgency here, a large gap, and in order to fill that gap, we need to maximize our support for adaptation. From where I'm sitting, that means scaling up all sources of finance, so international, domestic, public, and private finance. But we really need to, when we're doing this, we really need to take into account kind of the right mix of actors based on circumstances. And this is kind of coming back to the great difficulty of adaptation and adaptation policy making in general, is that it's very specific to sectors, to regions. So not everywhere we can see, and I think Paul's presentation also alluded to that, not everywhere and in every sector and in every country, there's an equally large role for the private sector. Some sectors in some countries will naturally depend more on public resources, depending on where they are, how vulnerable they are, and whether there's room to crowd in other sources of finance. But there's more than just the provision of finance that I want to talk about today. So we also have the issue of access to finance, which is crucial when it comes to delivering support in time, and also, and this is really an important one, decrease the transaction cost for developing countries to get to that finance. Because the longer they wait, the more capacity they have to invest to get that finance, the more costly getting that finance actually is. And then lastly, which is also overlooked but crucial, and maybe not really the scope of this presentation, but I wanted to highlight it anyways, is the sharing of knowledge and expertise, because we have to enable countries as well to be able to absorb that finance and then to translate that finance into action. So finance and UNFCCC discussions, really briefly, it comes back in various ways. So with the indicators, we're really struggling to see how can we measure adaptation effectiveness and what is the role of finance there. Obviously, finance tracking is really important, but equating adaptation progress solely to finance obviously brings us into difficult territory, as the more expensive options are not always the best adaptation options per se. So it's something that we have to very carefully phrase, and it will be one of those major talking points during next COP. Then for the national adaptation plans, we also need to talk about, how do we strengthen support for implementation specifically? So how does finance reach projects on the ground? It's not just a number, but also what providers you use, access and quality, and implementation ultimately depends on linking it with policy on the ground. Now, I'm also running a little bit over time, so I'll try to take a minute to briefly wrap this up. So what I wanted to draw attention to is basically how do we link global policy to local action. So the link from UNFCCC level discussions to local action is very complex, but our global commitments can gain value in the way that we are able to translate them into concrete projects. And here there's various challenges. There's a finance barrier. Funding structures are often difficult, and limited capacity makes it difficult for developing countries to kind of access finance in time and use that finance then effectively. And here I kind of want to use also this new guidelines for national adaptation plans as kind of something that offers us perspective, because it helps kind of these NAPs to be a bridge aligning kind of the global commitments with more national and local priorities. And that's important also because it offers kind of a way of kind of translating these priorities then in bankable local actions, which can help attract finance from all sorts of actors, public and private. I have a lot more to discuss here, but I think I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'll happily end on the notion that these are all topics obviously that have to be discussed in Belém, and that there's a lot of space, I think, to kind of improve also the quality of the finance that we provide to ensure that our discussions in Brazil also translate to actual action on the ground. Thanks
so much, Rick, and for sticking to your time as well, and for just underlying that public resources are needed, especially for SID and LDCs, and the need to scale up adaptation finance. So really hope to see the Netherlands continue to champion the topic at COP. And on that note, we have now about a bit more than 15 minutes for question and answer. I can see the chat is buzzing with some of the speakers already answering some of the questions, but please raise your hands and I'll take a few questions at a time. So if you want to take the floor, please do that. We'll stop sharing the screen so I can actually see the hands being raised. Well, thank you so much for the different insights, for the panel, for your great presentation. Thank you all so much. It's already one hand. Are there any more questions? So I can do. Okay. See Francis and Mizan. Francis can go first, and then Mizan can go second.
Hi there.
And
Thanks,
please
everybody.
introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Francis Heil. I'm an Associate Director in Climate Change and Resilience at Atkins Realis. Thanks for really interesting presentations and really useful perspectives on a very challenging topic. My question, I put it in the chat, but I thought maybe really ask it, I suppose. I guess I'm keen to hear what, given the findings and given the discussion we've had, what are the recommendations coming out of this that governments should take on board, or multilateral development banks should take on board to do something about this? We definitely need funding to go to adaptation. The study that Kit and Paul have undertaken probably shows a less than ideal result, that private investment might play a much smaller part than what we would have all hoped. So what can we do about that? Are there recommendations or mechanisms to increase that? Yeah, keen to kind of know what more could be done, do you think?
Thank you, Francis, so much. I'll just take 2 more questions before we let some of the speakers answer. Mizan, I can see you're next. Please introduce yourself when taking the floor.
Yeah, thank you. This is Professor Mizan Khan. Yeah, I have got to hear the limitations of barriers to adaptation finance, particularly by the private sector, as well as also by the public sector. You know, I have been continuously arguing for the barriers standing in the way of adaptation finance as 3 reasons. One is that adaptation is kind of viewed with a very narrow neoclassical perspective, that as if it does not bring in global public benefit. Then second reason is that there is a physical disconnect between the main causes of the problem and the sufferers of the problem. This is one, because the sufferers exist far away, and the causes are mostly the rich countries. And the third is the inefficacy of private sector, as you already have discussed. So my point is that if, for example, climate stability is regarded as a global public good, then why not disturbance of that stability through climate change impacts climate change should not be regarded as a global public bad, and addressing global public bad through adaptation, why not to be considered as a global public good? Then if there is consensus, then we can argue for funding, for looking for funding sources through penalizing or taxing the global public bads. And this is the most fundamental of solutions. As a student of economics in America, we have got to learn that the most foundational solution is the internalization of externality. And that is not done in air pollution, in emissions, because emissions don't stay put. But yeah, just 10 seconds. But solid waste dumping is extremely costly because they cannot be transported far away from the border. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will take one more point. For this round of question, I can see Sami has raised a hand. Please come in.
For the floor, my name is Sami. I work for the Quebec Federation of Labor as a representative union representative for climate and just transition issues. Now, I've heard Mr. Watkiss talk about de-risking investment. Now, given that de-risking often shifts costs and risk onto vulnerable population parties, what regulatory frameworks, mandatory disclosure rules, or other constraints could compel private sector to invest in adaptation finance, making resilience a business obligation rather than a subsidized option?
Thank you so much. I will now hand over to the speakers. I don't know who wants to answer what question. Paul, if you maybe want to come in on some of the points.
Yeah, absolutely. But I also want to let the others, or the other panelists, of course. I mean, I just want to start by highlighting something, and again, it's a sort of it's a perception issue. So the first thing I want to really highlight is that there's going to be lots of private sector adaptation in developed countries. So this is really, we have to be careful that people mix up some of the messages. A lot of it is going to happen in developed countries. We will pay for adaptation, but this is a specific issue for developing countries. And then the second thing is, even within developing countries, there's going to be a lot of private sector adaptation to, address the risks to private sector assets, to act in all those areas that I have on the right-hand side of my little figure, where the private sector acts already. So there's going to be huge amounts of private sector adaptation. And what we're really focused on here, though, is the fact that that private sector adaptation has to happen for the private sector's self-interest and to keep our economies sort of motoring along. But it's not a substitute for all the public sector activities that we need on top of that or alongside that. And definitely what we're highlighting is, those are the actions that have been primarily prioritized in NDCs and NAPs. And, I think, everyone would accept it's been much more difficult to get adaptation and the private sector to flow into that part of the matrix. And again, I also want to highlight, we are 15%, so it's 15% of that part of the landscape. And I think, based against that, there are a whole set of things that we're going to need to do to make sure the private sector adapts on that right-hand side of the figure. And there's lots of issues there around disclosure and trying to incentivize that to happen. And there will be lots of opportunities for goods and services there. What we need to do on the left-hand side, is we need to think about how we actually spur private sector investment without, as the last speaker says, about shifting some of these risks back or enabling or passing the costs back. And I think Some of the things there are already being done. There's lots of really innovative work around a whole range of things. You know, lots of talks about country platforms. There's lots of talk about addressing the enabling factors to allow the private sector to invest. I'm at a meeting here over in Manila, which is really looking at those, and I think there's positive things there as well. But I just want to highlight we also have to be a little bit realistic. We're talking about some areas which are very traditionally delivered by the public sector for very good reasons, because we've highlighted those. And there I think we just have to be a little bit more honest. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. But you know, we're not saying nothing is going to happen. We're saying lots will happen, but we're also trying to be a little bit more realistic and highlighting where the space is. But let me hand over for some of the panelists. I've talked a little bit too much, so.
Thanks so much, Paul. Rick, if you want to take up some of these points, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. And it's difficult coming after Paul giving such a comprehensive answer, but maybe from where I'm sitting, I think building up on Paul's answer, I think it's really important to understand this private sector contribution not as a replacement of finance that comes from the public sector. I mean, I think looking at the adaptation finance gap and ways to close that, I think it's important that it's fundamental to actually get all the actors in that we can get in, and to do very, as I said in my presentation as well, to very selectively look at what projects, where in which sectors can benefit from what type of actors. And if we can strengthen those connections, then we can, you know, get a lot closer to actually funding the right projects by the right actors. Then in addition to that, I think we also need to expedite the way that finance is provided currently. I think that at least one of my concerns really in this process is that, you know, finance takes sometimes too long. There's quite a time between kind of appealing for finance and then going towards a disbursement, which costs a lot of time, valuable time, but also costs, then increases the cost of the capital to actually get into the project, which is another detriment. And then lastly, and that's also part of kind of the approach that we take as the Netherlands in our provision of adaptation support in general, in addition to finance, building up this capacity to kind of translate the finance then into actions on the ground. I think that's kind of the third piece of the puzzle, so to say, that we really need to strengthen local capacities to ensure that, you know, actions are not only undertaken but also able to be sustained over the long run.
Here, I see Berta has come on camera. I don't know if you want to answer some of these points. I see Marcia as well. Please feel free to both come in before I take another round of question.
Yeah, maybe I'll just go really briefly, because I think one of the things that we're missing or not discussing enough, and I'm not going to go into the details, just put the topics out there for the co-presidency to consider as well, is not only de-risking the private sector, but regulating the private sector and taxing the private sector. I think, you know, the things that were mentioned about internalizing, I think Professor Khan was mentioning some of those things. And now the word I'm missing, but basically internalizing the externalities and stuff like that. Here we're talking about regulating the private sector. And in the broader context, we also need to tax it better in order to raise public finance in a context that we're finding us right now. So I think, just to put it out there, I mean, yeah, it's nice to work with the private sector, and partnerships will probably solve certain of the problems, but we should also be considering stronger regulations and taxation for the private sector as a means to raising more public finance and addressing some of the dangers, I would say, that are there. Thanks.
Berta, and over to you, Marcia.
Yeah, I do think the panelists have covered very well many of the points and angles that were reflected today, but I want to go a little bit as well deeper on how to tackle these from a system lens. And fully agree, this is not a recipe for one model, one approach. There is a contextual angle that as well we need to reflect. Yes, adaptation in developed world the role of the private sector might be different and also more prepared than in the developing world. And there are, success stories, but also failures. Very critical the points in regards of how we track progress. I think for me, this is one of the most core sensitive points, because it's not just about tracking progress on actions, but also what are the impacts of those actions in regards of nature, people, and other variables. In that we are still in a very starting stage with hopefully an outcome on the global goal and adaptation in regards of the metrics framework to be able to track progress. But we have not yet aligned and harmonized all the methodologies that help us translate those actions into impact. And without a common approach, it's going to be even much more harder to bring public finance, MDB finance, philanthropy finance, to tell a similar story, and then to also help articulate the opportunities that we have at hand. The other one is to also recognize that there are levers that actually are evolving in a much faster pace, and maybe we are not necessarily tackling them. So for adaptation and resilience, we mostly focus on the past, on levers that deals with capacity building, of course, very critical, on levers that deals with access of finance or finance mobilization, policy shift, and I'm missing one. I will remember. But what it becomes even extremely important for the role of the private sector as one very key, let's say, actor in the bigger picture of finance mobilization or capital mobilization is understanding risk, having access to risk information, and being able to inform and integrate that to shape decisions that are part of the core strategy, not necessarily seen as a marketing or donor philanthropic approach. That access to risk, incorporating that information and fully having a shift is a strong lever that is informing and actually interesting to as well being able to follow up. The other one is an attention to an economy of adaptation, maybe very nascent, extremely nascent, where supply and demand of adaptation solutions and adaptation solution providers, mostly SMEs, play a huge role. And how do we integrate all of that in the picture of the opportunity, but the actual progress? I unfortunately have to say there is very little track progress on all of those layers. I think this is one of the major gaps that we have. How can we better integrate that as part of the picture and recognize, but as well, these market levers are not going to be sufficient? Of course not. They might be growing and they might be existent, and therefore what attention we pay to also shape those levers so that they don't necessarily run wild. No, so that's just to say a few points for system change. Thanks.
Very sorry to interrupt you, Marcia, and thank you so much for your point. I wish we had more time, but we are at the hour. I can see there are another hand. Kate, feel free to reach out and we'll make sure to answer your question. Wish we had more time to hear from the great panelists. But we are but a minute away. So I just wanted to say a few closing remarks. Just first of all, thank you all for your insights, for the questions. I can see the chat is still buzzing. It was really great to see so much interest in the topic, in the reports, and just to make sure that the momentum turns into action. And with countries expected to submit new national climate plans this year, I really hope to see that governments are using COP to consider how to support the implementation of these plans, including with adaptation finance. As we talked about quite a bit already, the developed countries' commitment to at least double their collective provision of adaptation finance by 2025 is ending this year. So there's a clear opportunity again to agree a new commitment for adaptation finance, despite the geopolitics around climate finance becoming more and more challenges. It's really critical, and the new report really shows that public finance for adaptation remains essential. So that's why why such commitment matters. And as Paul explained so well, while the private sector has a role to play, its contribution to adaptation finance remains quite limited. And yes, it will grow and it could grow, but even then public finance will remain key. So I really, really hope that this new data will inform upcoming discussions on climate finance and provides a more, I guess, nuanced and realistic understanding of the role of the private sector as we all gear up for a few busy months ahead. So on this note, I'll let you go back to your day. I will share the recording as well as the slides and a summary of the event very soon. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and wishing you a really nice rest of your day.